This program today is being filmed and will be mounted on the LC intranet and internet. And staff members in Culpeper are accessing it by video teleconferencing. So we'll be watching to make sure they don't lose a connection. Also, staff in the music division who are teleworking are accessing it live via WebEx. And if you can hear me and you've already joined, if you lose connection, you need to let me know or Angela, and we'll do something about restoring the connection. You can email us. I'm standing in today for Beecher Wiggins, the Director of Acquisitions and Bibliographic Access, who is on jury duty. Yeah, he's got a juicy case, apparently. Although the adoption of the new RDA at LC is at least a year away, we know you're eager to hear about it, and we at LC are very fortunate to have two persons that are extremely well qualified to speak about the new RDA, and that is Kate James and Damien Eisminger. Now, Kate James is a cataloging policy specialist in the Policy, Training and Cooperative Programs Division of the Acquisitions and Bibliographic Access Directorate at the Library of Congress. Kate has been involved with RDA since 2010, so she's got many years of experience, when she served as one of the LC testers for the US RDA test. In 2011, Kate transferred to the Policy and Standards Division to help with the implementation of RDA at LC. Not sure what that is. Kate's duties in PTCP include editing several cataloging policy documents, including the Library of Congress Program for Cooperative Cataloging Policy Statements used with RDA. Kate is the RDA Examples Editor of the RDA Steering Committee, a position she's held since 2013. In her capacity as the RDA Example Editor, she is a member of RDA 3R Core Team, charged with the development of RDA Restructure and Redesign project. She is also a member of the North American RDA Committee, NARDAC. Damien Eisminger is the head of the Bibliographic and Access section of the Music Division of the Special Collections Directorate at the Library of Congress. And it's a position he's held since January 2017. He previously worked for the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston from 2007 to 2017 as the head of technical services. For the RDA Steering Committee, he has been chair of the Music Working Group from 2014 to 2019, a member of the Aggregates Working Group from 2017 to 2019, and he's currently a member of the North American RDA Committee, NARDAC. And Kate's going to be addressing you first.
Hello. Some of you might be hearing these beeping noises. That's people joining in through WebEx, and there's really nothing we can do about that. So sorry, but hopefully it won't happen throughout the whole presentation just as we're starting. So today, Damien and I will be speaking to you about the new RDA, which is currently located on the RDA Toolkit beta site. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, relax. You have not missed anything. Before discussing the new RDA, here's a reminder about the current state of RDA. There are no changes to your current cataloging work. You should continue to catalog using the official version of RDA, which is located in the RDA Toolkit that you log into every day. The new version of RDA, located on the Toolkit beta site, should not be used to catalog. a lot of things have to happen before it's time for you to start using new RDA. The RDA board and the RDA steering committee must approve the new RDA as the official version of RDA at the completion of the 3R project. There is no definite date for this because there are several dependencies, including the completion of translations and policy statements. After new RDA is approved, there will be a transition period before we begin using the new RDA. This transition period will include training on the new RDA. In the meantime, if you are interested, you may look at the content of the RDA Toolkit beta site, but do not use it to catalog. Sorry, you're going to hear me say that a few more times today, just to be clear. So, the toolkit is available on a link from the current toolkit. You must log in to view most of the content. The beta site contains new RDA instructions. It does not currently contain any translations or policy statements yet. The work of the 3R project is ongoing, so the content on the site changes with each update. At this point, you're probably wondering, what is this 3R project she is talking about? The 3R project stands for RDA Toolkit, Restructure, and Redesign project. These are the main components. A restructure of underlying data and work processes to facilitate toolkit publishing. You won't see the results of this work as a toolkit user, but for the past 2 years, the RSC and toolkit developers have transferred RDA into DITA files. DITA stands for Darwin Information Typing Architecture, and it is an XML-based standard used widely in online publishing. The second component of the 3R project is a redesign of the toolkit and user experience. I will speak more about this in a moment. And the third component is a revision to RDA and RDA reference content. Damien and I will explain some of the major changes to RDA content today. So, why is the reaction most catalogers have when they're first presented with the idea of the 3R project? This is understandable. It seems like not so long ago when I was sitting in this audience listening to Barbara Tillett tell me about a new cataloging standard called Resource Description and Access. It's actually a very long time ago by web publishing standards, which so for people that are using WebEx, would you mind muting? Because we can hear it, I believe it's picking up on the recording. Thank you. So where was I? A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Barbara Tillett was up here, and yeah, I was out there, and okay. But yes, a very long time ago by web publishing standards, which explains the first reason why the 3R project is necessary. The original RDA toolkit was published in 2010 and has not undergone a significant redesign since then. It is beyond time for a redesign to meet accessibility standards. Also, you may have noticed that the current tools for searching and customizing your user experience are insufficient and unreliable. The second reason for the 3R project is internationalization, because RDA is being used now on every continent except Antarctica. Maybe next year. The third reason for the project is the Library Reference Model, a conceptual model developed by the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, hence IFLA LRM. I'm not going to discuss the design aspects of the beta site toolkit today, but here's a quick look at the home page. I hope you will find that it looks and works much more like a web page instead of a giant technical document that someone published online. internationalization is the second reason I gave you for the 3R project. Again, I will not be discussing this in depth, but these are a few examples of this. Many English-speaking users of RDA probably do not realize that RDA is currently available in 7 other languages besides English. The number of translations will increase with new RDA, so ALA Publishing and the RSC consider these changes essential for facilitating new translations. Of these examples of internationalization, the ones you will notice the most are the standardization of element labels and more options for greater flexibility. And now Damien will speak to you about the IFLA LRM and its impact on RDA content. Don't worry, I'll be coming back later to talk to you more about RDA content.
Thank you, Kate. So the original RDA is aligned with the conceptual models for bibliographic and authority data developed by the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, or IFLA, and they were released between 1998 and 2011. They are the functional requirements for bibliographic records, the functional requirements for authority data, and functional requirements for subject authority data. The first model, functional requirements for bibliographic records, better known by you by its acronym FRBR, is the model that most of you are probably the most familiar with. Released in 1998, it introduces 3 groups of entities. Group 1 consists of the familiar entities work, expression, manifestation, and item, linked together through primary relationships. Work is realized by expression, is embodied in manifestation, is exemplified by item. The Group 2 entities are the producers of works, expressions, manifestations, and items. These are the persons and corporate bodies. The Group 3 entities are additional entities outside of the Group 1 and Group 2 entities that have a subject relationship with works, concepts, objects, events, and places. All of these entities have attributes associated with them and may also have relationships with the other entities. FRBR also defined 4 user tasks: to find resources that correspond to a user search criteria, to identify or distinguish between the same or similar resources, to select a resource appropriate to a user's needs, and to obtain a resource. The second model, released in 2009, were the functional requirements for authority data, or FRAD. This model built upon and expanded FRBR. For example, the family entity in RDA was added because it was defined in FRAD. FRAD also expanded definitions of several FRBR entities which affected RDA, which I will get into a bit later. The third and final model were the functional requirements for subject authority data, released in 2011. Conceived as a high-level model for subject relationships, its release had little impact on RDA, as it was published after Toolkit adoption in 2010. However, concepts explored in FRSAD ended up having a profound effect on RDA development when IFLA decided that the 3 models should be consolidated. Now, all 3 of the functional requirement models, or FR models, are closely related, but because each model was developed by separate groups over time, each with their own perspective, invariably inconsistencies and contradictions sprung up between the 3 models. IFLA recognized this as a less than ideal situation, and so in 2013, it tasked a consolidation editorial group to bring the 3 models together into a single whole. This was also an opportunity to resolve some still lingering questions, especially as it regarded aggregates and serials. The result of this effort is the IFLA Library Reference Model, or IFLA LRM, approved in 2017. This single model supersedes the 3 previous FR models. Because RDA is based on the FR models, any changes to the models, including consolidation, must be reflected in RDA. In the LRM model as implemented by RDA, many of the concepts that you are already familiar with are still present. So here we have the work, expression, manifestation item stack. We have agents, which consist of persons and collective agents. The collective agents are further subclassed as families and corporate bodies. These have related works, expressions, manifestations, and items. All of these entities together are RDA entities. Additionally, so are timespan and place, and they may also be associated with any of the other named entities. Finally, all RDA entities are known by a nomen. Now, time does not permit me to go over the LRM model in more detail and to go over all its impacts on the new RDA. However, I'd like to take a moment to highlight a few of the changes that have happened as a result of consolidation and how these changes are manifested in the new RDA. So, as I mentioned earlier, the LRM was created to resolve contradictions between the three previous models. One of these contradictions concerned the definition of a person. In FRBR, a person was defined as an individual and encompassed individuals that were living as well as those that were deceased. According to the FRBR authors, this was limited to real people. In FRAD, the definition was expanded to an individual or a persona or identity established or adopted by an individual or a group. Here the position was that persons could be both real and fictitious. The version of RDA that you use right now to catalog adopted the FRAD definition. However, in LRM, a person was defined to be an individual human being. Because of this, the new RDA had to change its definition in order to be aligned with LRM. So what does this mean? No longer are fictitious characters, real animals, spirits, deities, or other non-human personages considered to be persons. While this is quite a shift in thinking, and it seems to upend a lot of work that has already been done in making access points for non-human personages, please rest assured that plans are being made to continue to accommodate these kinds of access points for our cataloging going into the future. However, we will no longer be able to consider these as names for RDA persons. Three of the new entities in the new RDA are the RDA Entity, Timespan, and Nomen. The RDA Entity is the superclass of the other 12 entities in RDA. The reasons for its existence is that it is important for data modeling. For example, it may be used to convert legacy data when more granularity is not possible because of how the original data was formatted and structured. Timespan is defined as a temporal extent having a beginning, an end, and a duration. In RDA, this temporal extent can be defined as exactly or as loosely as one would like. Timespans that we are all familiar with include dates of birth or death, dates of establishment or termination, publication dates, and dates of works, just to name a few. Single dates are included as timespans because they represent an extent of time with a beginning and an end. For example, today, July 16, 2019, started at midnight and will end at 11:59 p.m. and 59 seconds. The other big change concerning entities is the new entity nomen. It is defined as a designation that refers to an RDA entity except nomen. While this new entity may seem esoteric, it really isn't. What this new entity allows us to do is that we could say things about strings, such as what script was used and what language was used. Nomens can be names of people and titles of works, ISNI codes, or access points, just to name a few. In our current day-to-day cataloging, this change in RDA should not actually have much of an impact. We may not be able to fully realize the benefits of nomen until we have moved into a linked data cataloging environment. The LRM also tackles an issue that had not been dealt with in the previous models, and that is the situation surrounding aggregates. So an aggregate is defined simply as a manifestation embodying multiple expressions of works. Each aggregated expression is the realization of a single aggregated work. An aggregate manifestation also embodies a plan for selecting and arranging the content in the aggregate, called the aggregating work, which in turn is realized by an aggregating expression. And this is important, it is not the content itself. So to explain this a little bit better in graphical form, for example, we have a manifestation here that says it is the complete plays of William Shakespeare. So in addition to embodying each play, it also embodies a plan for this aggregate, namely that it is publishing the complete plays authored by Shakespeare and is arranging them in chronological order by date of work. Practically, and this is why the boxes on the right, are in dashes. In our everyday cataloging, we won't need to identify or say anything about this planned work. But it is important to say that it exists in case we might, for some reason, want to identify it. 3 kinds of aggregates exist. The collection aggregate is a manifestation that embodies 2 or more independent expressions of 2 or more independent works. This could be, for example, a collection of sonnets by William Shakespeare, a festschrift honoring a colleague, or an album of songs performed by a single group. The augmentation aggregate is a manifestation that embodies a main work and 1 or more supporting works. Examples include illustrations for a previously existing novel, an introduction or afterword to a main work, or they could be extras on a Blu-ray disc. The final type of aggregate is a parallel aggregate and is a manifestation that embodies 2 or more expressions of a single work. Examples include books with parallel translations or notated music with some words in multiple languages. So now I'd like to take the opportunity to get into some of important concepts in the new RDA toolkit. So recording methods are ways of capturing data in the new RDA. It explicitly defines 4 methods for doing this. The methods are unstructured description, structured description, identifiers, and IRI. These recording methods are a regularization of what was already present in RDA. So I would like to go over the specifics of each recording method so that you are all better able to understand the concepts and how they might be applied in different cataloging environments. An unstructured description is defined as a recording method that is a human readable string that is an uncontrolled full or partial description of an entity or an uncontrolled term describing an aspect of that entity. So examples of unstructured descriptions include an unstructured note, that is, a note in natural language, an uncontrolled term for a concept, or a name or title in direct order, as it appears in sources of information. The data produced from using an unstructured description is dumb data. That is, while an unstructured note might be meaningful to a human, the only thing that a computer can reliably extract from an unstructured description are its keywords and their proximity to other keywords. This recording method is probably best suited for recording information about how a resource represents itself and using that information to identify similarities or differences between resources. So related to this method is the issue of transcription. RDA offers 2 methods for transcribing information. The first method is normalized transcription. This is the type of transcription that most of us are used to. It includes guidelines for altering or retaining capitalization, diacritical marks, punctuation, etc. So this method requires cataloger intervention and judgment. But if you think about it, this is not really true transcription. It is transcription that is normalized so that displays of information can be standardized. So in order to address those situations where true transcription is desired, RDA has a second method, which is basic transcription. Here, the emphasis is very much on take what you see. All capitalization, numerals, and diacritics are transcribed as they appear on the source of information. All white space, including multiple spaces, new lines, indentations, etc., are collapsed into a single white space. This method requires a minimal degree of intervention and is more suited to machine transcription of information. So policies will be required to determine the appropriate context for each transcription method. Moving on to the second recording method, structured descriptions include the following types. You could have an access point, you could have a term for a concept from a controlled vocabulary, or a value associated with a structured data type, including numbers, dates, and times. A structured description is associated with a vocabulary encoding scheme or a string encoding scheme. I realize that there is a lot to unpack here with these two terms, so let's just go through each of them briefly. A vocabulary encoding scheme is defined as a named structured list of representations of controlled values for elements. So examples include the RDA value vocabularies. These are the vocabularies that most of you are already familiar with, especially as it regards content type, media type, and carrier type. There are over 40 RDA value vocabularies that can all be accessed from the new toolkit. Another example are terms from Library of Congress, genre form terms. And yet another example are access points from the Library of Congress NACO authority file. So therefore, a vocabulary encoding scheme is nothing more than a list of terms that have been controlled in some way and that represent concepts, names of agents, or titles of resources. A string encoding scheme is defined as a set of string values and an associated set of rules that describe a mapping between that set of strings and a value of an element. I realize that this is a very technical definition, so I've included some examples of what I mean. A string encoding scheme that we use in our everyday work is ISBD. So this example here is how we formulate strings for the title and statement of responsibility statement. In this example, we could formally define the string encoding scheme in the following manner. Begin the statement with a value of title proper, in this case, the history of the Jews in Venice. Follow the title proper with a value of statement of responsibility, Cecil Roth. Precede the statement of responsibility with a space / space. String encoding schemes can also be used to define the format of a particular string. An excellent example of this are dates entered in mark field 046. Dates with day precision are given in the format YYYY-MM-DD. The string encoding scheme that covers this is the extended date time format. The third recording method is Identifier. An identifier is defined as in RDA as a recording method that is a machine-readable string that is assigned to an entity in order to differentiate the entity from other entities within a local domain, or a notation for a term from a controlled vocabulary that is assigned to an aspect of the entity. Examples of identifiers include the following. Identifiers from an external agent, such as an ISSN, or a code from a marked code list, such as the code for language of content. The use of the identifier recording method depends on your implementation scenario of RDA and on cataloging context, system needs, and so on. The final recording method is IRI. It stands for Internationalized Resource Identifier. In all respects, it is identical to a URI. The only difference is that an IRI is a URI that can accommodate all Unicode characters. IRIs are used in semantic web technologies such as linked data. While it seems similar to an RDA identifier, it plays a completely different role. An RDA identifier is a kind of nomen that is an application for an entity or a concept. An IRI, on the other hand, in terms of the semantic web, is the actual entity or is the actual concept. The main thing you really need to remember is that the IRI recording method is only applicable when recording cataloging data for linked data applications. Each of the recording methods is related in some way to implementation scenarios for RDA. If you were to implement RDA in linked data, the IRI method would probably be your preferred method. If you were using a relational database, the identifier method may be more appropriate. Traditional library catalogs use the structure description method to provide intellectual access. Finally, flat file implementations would make more use of unstructured descriptions. For some elements, all 4 options are viable for recording data values. For other elements, such as those that are transcribed from a manifestation, only certain recording methods are allowed. So the current RDA was written before the full flowering of linked data. With the release of the new RDA, semantic web concerns have now come to the foreground. One of the ways that this has been made explicit is with the new recording method of IRI for recording the values of the RDA elements. Another way this has become explicit, albeit in a more subtle way, are the new element reference boxes that have information about the RDA element presented in a linked data way. The IRI for the element is present when you click on the element reference box, along with the domain and range of the element. In short, the new RDA has been designed to take full advantage of linked data technologies. So Kate will come back up to talk about relationship elements and other features of the new RDA toolkit.
So, before I begin discussing RDA relationships, relationship elements, let's take a quick look about how relationships work in general. Relationships connect 2 things. For example, Kate has employer, LC, shows the connection between me and the Library of Congress. Relationships are inherently reciprocal, meaning I can take any relationship, flip the subject and object, and express a new relationship that is the inverse of the first one. Put more simply, because I have a relationship to LC, LC has a relationship to me. So, the inverse of the statement, Kate has employer LC, is LC has employee Kate. Another characteristic of relationships is that they help define one thing by defining its relationship to another. When I say Kate has employer LC, you realize that I am not talking about Kate McKinnon, the actress employed by NBC on the show Saturday Night Live. Although there may be many more Kates at the Library of Congress besides me, the potential number of Kates has been significantly narrowed by providing the relationship Kate has employer LC. The same relationship can be expressed multiple ways without changing the meaning. One way is a graph that provides a visual representation of my relationship to LC. Another method is to use an RDF triple. If you are unfamiliar with this term, don't worry, you don't need to understand RDF to understand relationships. If you already know about RDF triples, just ignore me for the next 30 seconds. RDF stands for Resource Description Framework. Relationships are modeled in RDF with statements that have a subject, predicate, and object. The subject is the thing being described, the predicate is the relationship, and the object is the thing being related. So in the statement, Kate has employer LC, Kate is the subject, has employer as the predicate, and LC is the object. In linked data, an RDF triple would be expressed with IRIs representing each part of the statement. In this example, I have shown strings that would be the human readable values for those IRIs because machines read IRIs and people read strings. The final method for expressing relationships is the one we use in cataloging, an RDA relationship element. You may notice how similar this example, Kate, employer, LC, looks to the previous ones. This is no accident. Data produced using RDA can be presented in many ways using the recording methods Damien described. This slide covers some of the characteristics of relationship elements in the new RDA. Just like in the current version of RDA, relationship elements relate to RDA entities. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. There are no relationship designators in the new RDA. This is because relationship designators have become relationship elements. As shocking as this may seem, it's really a very logical progression. As in, the work Too Darn Hot has creator Cole Porter. Creator, it's a relationship element most of you should be familiar with. It's a musical work, so it would be appropriate to say that Too Darn Hot has composer, Cole Porter, and composer is a type of creator. Therefore, it follows that composer is also a relationship element. So, in the new RDA, you won't find any relationship designators, but you'll find lots of relationship elements. This means that in the new RDA, each relationship element has its own page with instructions. I hope your experience will be that this makes it easier to find and apply these elements, as they will no longer be relationship designators listed in 4 very long appendices. Here's an example of what a page for a relationship element looks like in the new toolkit. This is the top of the page for the relationship element adaptation of work. Note that work, the entity being described by this element, appears in the breadcrumbs trail. The screenshot only shows the top of the page, so just imagine that there are instructions on recording this element after the blue element reference box. I mentioned that relationships are inherently reciprocal. In the new RDA, we use the term inverse to designate that reciprocal relationship. In the left column are some relationship elements, and in the right column are their corresponding inverse relationship elements. A relationship element is defined as the inverse of another one, so there is no static list of inverse relationship elements. It is equally correct to say that work expressed has inverse expression of work, as it is to say expression of work has inverse work expressed. Damien mentioned that LRM introduced some new entities in RDA. This means that some of the original RDA attributes are now relationship elements. For example, date of birth is an attribute element you should be familiar with in the current toolkit, used to identify a person. The new entity timespan transforms this attribute into a relationship element because date of birth now relates to RDA entities, person and timespan, as in person has date of birth timespan. Applying this element to a specific instance of person, we can say Amy Tan has date of birth 1952. Because this is a relationship element, there is also an inverse relating timespan to person. So we would say timespan is date of birth of person, or 1952 is date of birth of Amy Tan. I'm sure that several of you are thinking, why would we want to say that? Are we going to relate every person born in 1952 to that time span? The answer is no, we don't have to do that. Obviously, in this example, the relationship is not as useful to identify 1952 as it is to identify Amy Tan. However, you might imagine situations where providing both relationships is helpful to end users. For example, Mona Lisa has artist person Leonardo da Vinci, and Leonardo da Vinci is artist person of Mona Lisa. Ideally, we will work in a system when generating an inverse relationship requires no more than clicking on a button that says create inverse. You may have noticed that I have been using element labels that seem to have slightly different naming conventions. For example, sometimes I've used a label that has a verb, like has artist person, and sometimes I've used a label with no verb, like artist person. This is part of the flexibility of new RDA. There are multiple labels available to express the same element. The first label is the Toolkit label, which is the one that appears on the top of the element page. These labels do not have verbs, so person, member of family is an example of a Toolkit label. Then, if you open up the element reference box, you'll see alternate labels. There should be at least one alternate label which contains a verb, like has person, member of family. There may be other alternate labels available, like family member, which is the original Toolkit label. Let's take a look at a screenshot of this from the new Toolkit. So here we go. Here's the element reference page. At the top, we have the Toolkit label, person, member of family. Then I click open the element reference box, and I see that I have two alternate labels available. The first is the verbalized label, has person, member of family. Not every element will have multiple alternate labels, but in this case, there are multiple elements, and the second one is the original Toolkit label. This example has only one original Toolkit label, but sometimes there are more. Some elements have had an easier transition than others into new RDA. Appellation elements are another feature of the new RDA, but once again, you should find this familiar content. Appellation elements can be divided into three types. The first type are the name or title elements. Name of is used for RDA entity, agent, including all the subtypes like person, collective agent, family, corporate body, place, and time span. Title of is used for the WEMI entities, work, expression, manifestation, and item. So examples of the name of labels would be name of place, name of corporate body. Examples of the title of labels would be title of work and title of manifestation. This type of appellation element is easy for a human being to understand, assuming the human being knows the language that the instance of this element is in. In other words, if the title's in Hebrew, you're still going to have to read Hebrew to understand it. The second type of appellation element is an access point. Some of you savvy Toolkit users might know that access points are actually not elements in the original RDA, despite having numerous instructions about them. However, in new RDA, access points are elements, which makes modeling and mapping so much easier. Access points are often easy for human beings to understand with a bit of background about the syntax encoding scheme, or SES. For example, I know that access points for work in the name authority file will have the access point for the creator first, if there is one, followed by the preferred title, followed by preferred title for work, and then perhaps there might be some additional information. However, I'm a cataloger, so reading access points is almost like reading my native language. I think most of our end users would easily recognize that in the access point for work, Morrison, Tony, beloved, Morrison, Tony, is the inverted name of the creator, and beloved is the title of the work. Access points for works that are more complex than this may be a bit confusing for our end users, but are still understandable to a human being with the appropriate background knowledge. The third type of appellation element is an identifier element. These elements follow the predictable naming pattern identifier for whatever the name of the entity is. An example of this would be identifier for item. Identifiers are made for machines to understand, not human beings. So we don't have time to get into the details of all of the appellation elements today, but I wanted to give you some highlights. Name of agent elements have two subtypes, preferred name of agent and variant name of agent. The element value is recorded as found in the source of information. So if my title page says Charles Dickens, then that's what I record for my name of agent value. Name of agent may still be transliterated if they are found in a source in a different script than the one preferred by the agent creating the metadata. For example, Makedonska Pravoslavna Crkva was found on the source of information in Cyrillic script, and I transliterated it according to the ALA LC romanization table for Macedonian. It's the name of a corporate body. Although the name of agent elements are relationship elements, I'll explain how this works in a minute. So, title of work elements have a lot of similarities to the name of agent elements. Again, there's two types, preferred title of work and variant title of work. Again, we may transliterate the title depending on our preferences. For example, I've transliterated the title Nochnoi Dozor from Cyrillic script according to the ALA LC romanization table for Russian. All of the title of work elements are relationship elements. So, access point for agent. So, this is where things should be very familiar to you. Personal names recorded as part of an access point may be inverted to put a surname first. For example, Lucci, Susan. But notice this is in an access point element, not in a name of element. Other elements may be recorded as part of an access point. For example, Hall, Donald, 19, oops. That's wrong. 1928 to 2018. Sorry, he's dead. Don't worry, it's correct in the LC NACO authority file. Anyway, this is an example of an access point where we have the person's name and then we have date of birth and date of death. Again, all of the access point elements are relationship elements. And again, as I said before, the identifier elements are the type of appellation elements most useful for machines. They require minimal normalization for their transcription. Please note that in new RDA, IRIs are not values for identifier elements. As Damien explained, IRIs are a recording method used for an entity or an element. Here's an example of an identifier. Notice how it means nothing to us. Notice that this string is also fairly useless to a machine without the vocabulary encoding scheme in which the identifier is found. The vocabulary encoding scheme, or VES, for the identifier is not part of the element itself, but it will be recorded as the data provenance for the element. In this case, the source is VIOF, or VIOF. So once my machine knows this, it knows how to treat this identifier and provide me with the human readable label, Pearl, Nancy, which is the person this identifier represents. I realize I forgot to repeat my refrain on this slide, but rest assured, Identifier for elements are relationship elements as well. The reason I keep saying that is because I wanted to talk to you a little bit how nomens work with relationship elements. Nomen is the new RDA entity that represents the elephant in the room for most of us. When the core team was discussing what to say about nomen in the new RDA toolkit, my first comment was, do we have to say anything about this at all? I was afraid nobody would understand or see the value of implementing nomen in new RDA. Frankly, I didn't see the point of it beyond data modeling for a while. However, I've done a complete 360 on nomen, and it's now my current favorite RDA entity obsession. So I actually have those. My nomen revelation happened when I was preparing for the RDA pre-conference for this year's ALA annual, because I finally had a chance to see how nomen could work in real-world cataloging. I don't expect to make you a member of the nomen fan club today, but I hope you'll remember when I say today, I hope you'll remember what I say today as you hear more about nomen in the future. Describing nomens by themselves is pretty boring and doesn't seem useful to me for real-world cataloging, but using Appellation Elements, we can see how to relate a nomen to another RDA entity. This might look odd when we use strings to identify an instance of an entity. As you can see here, it looks like we have a redundant statement. Horace has name of person Horace. However, it isn't redundant when you actually understand that this actually means the person Horace has name of person nomen Horace, so it's relating two different RDA entities. As Damien mentioned, we might not be able to take full advantage of the nomen entity until we move to a linked data implementation scenario, because we must be able to separate the nomen from the entity represented by the appellation element value. Put more simply, we need to be able to make a clear distinction between a person and their name. I'm a person and Kate is a name. You would use the name Kate to represent me in conversation, as in, Kate talked about nomens for way too long today. But there is a distinction between me and my name. This becomes important when dealing with pseudonyms. Currently, we pretend like we have two different people in the name authority file, Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens. However, we know that there is actually one person with two name values. Person has name of person Mark Twain, and person has name of person Samuel Clemens. I'm going to show you how nomen works with two different names used by the same person for different works. Some of you will find this totally confusing, and some of you will love it. If you find it totally confusing, I promise there are other ways to understand how nomen works without seeing graphs. If you find it useful, welcome to the Nomen Fan Club. So, I have a person, and I've got two nomens. Nomen 1 has nomen string Kim Harrison. I want to relate my person to this nomen with this value. I use the relationship element has name of person. Now I've got this work hanging out here, and I'm using the title of work to represent the work because I only had so much room on this slide. But I could do the same thing with the entities for work that I did for person. So again, I've got this work. I want to say that it's associated with the name Kim Harrison. I say that nomen 1 has related work of nomen dead witch walking. Therefore, I've related the name Kim Harrison to this work. And then I can relate this work to the person who's the creator of the work, like this. Now I've got this other nomen, Dawn Cook. And I know that person A also uses this nomen. So again, I've got the relationship between the nomen to the string, has nomen string. Now I want to relate my person to the second nomen using has name of person. And now I've got this other workout here that is associated with the name Dawn Cook. So I relate the nomen and the work, and then I can relate the work to my person, who's the creator of the work. So seems like a lot of work. I understand this. This is a model of how this could work. Again, in a practical cataloging scenario, it's not this complicated, but I wanted to walk you through step by step as much as possible for that. So that's all the features of the new RDA that we have time to talk about today. In summation, remember that there are no changes to your current cataloging work. While you are cataloging using the original RDA, LC and PCC will be working on policies for new RDA behind the curtain, and there will be future presentations about the new RDA, so stay tuned. There's a lot of great information available about the new RDA and the 3R project. These are some of the sources Damien and I used for our presentation today. The videos mentioned here are available on the RDA Toolkit YouTube channel. I bet you didn't know that such a thing existed. It does, and there are actually 399 subscribers, so help get us up to 400 today. So Chris Oliver's view on the IFLA Library Reference Model has the most views, but I'm catching up with some of my videos. Chris's video is a great simplified explanation of everything you need to know about the IFLA Library Reference Model to understand the new RDA. So, if there are any questions, Damien and I will be happy to take them, depending on which one of us seems to be the most appropriate one to answer them. Yes.
Regina Reynolds, U.S. Pearl. My question has
Oh,
to...
sorry. Am I going to need to repeat the question for the recording? Okay.
My question has to do with the policy statements and how far they might be able to depart from what's going to be in the new RDA. For example, it is in the beta that a change in frequency of a serial could be reason to make a new description. That would be a nightmare in practice. And other people within concert are saying, we just can't do that. My assumption is that a policy statement could emerge from the PCC that could make that not happen. I don't want that to happen. But seriously, the basic question is, what kind of flexibility is there in the policy statements to come up with community decisions about how to apply the new RDA?
Okay, so Regina was asking about how closely the new policy statements would have to match RDA. What kind of flexibility will communities have to continue their current or desired practices? And she was specifically asking about frequency and whether a change in frequency would signal a new work in our current in our implementation of the new RDA, because it says in the beta toolkit that a change in frequency could signal a change in work. So the general comment about how far can the policies go, well, you know, there's no policy statement police, Okay, the RSC is not going to vet all of the policy statements. Again, they trust that the users of RDA will make the decisions that are consistent with implementing RDA in a practical way in their own environment. So just as we do now, it's really up to us to decide how far we can go and still say this is RDA. I would say that in general, we can extend the instructions in the toolkit, in the new toolkit. We can choose an option or not choose an option because it's optional. But we can't really directly contradict the inherent philosophy of the new RDA. In terms of the specific question about frequency, that's really way into the weeds for me to be answering today. And I will say that there's going to be task groups dealing with diachronic. There's going to be a task group dealing with diachronic works, and so I'm sure they will address that question, and I have great confidence in those people who include serials experts to be able to make a decision that will work for our current cataloging work.
Hi, I'm Netanel Ganin, US ASH, Social Sciences. One thing I was curious about, and this you touched on this a little bit at ALA, at your presentation at the RDA Update Forum. With fictitious characters, and I know that's a whole stress point, not being people anymore, there was an example that you gave at ALA that I think Deborah, biblical figure, is still a person because she's assumed to have lived. Whereas Vishnu, Hindu deity, here was not a person. And I was just wondering if there was any anticipation of infighting on which religion's figures were real and which ones were not. And I'm hoping that there's some circumvention of that, because I just don't want to see that become a whole thing.
Okay, so I was asked a question about a presentation that I gave at ALA Annual. It was actually at CCDA, not at the Update Forum, and it was about non-human personages in the new RDA. So since you haven't seen that presentation, I don't want to get too much into that, but the general question is, okay, so in IFLA LRM, it says that a person is a real human being that lived or is presumed to have lived. So that is where I was saying that there are people presented as people, human beings in the Bible that we don't really have historical data on. So, who knows if they lived or didn't live. At this point, we'll probably never know. But we can assume that they lived, and therefore they can be considered to meet the RDA definition of person. And the example I gave was Delilah in the Bible. Now, Vishnu, Hindu deity, so gods are not human beings because they're gods. So the question of whether Vishnu is real or not is not something that is addressed by RDA, and I would say that that is something that is best not addressed by cataloging policy. Because, and again, it's not a question of whether Vishnu is real, it's a question of whether Vishnu meets the definition of person. As a deity, Vishnu does not. So again, I am not making any statement about whether these deities are real or not. It's neither is RDA, neither is LRM. All that is being said is that deities are not human beings.
Bob Morgan from Germanic and Slavic Division, and mine is just a comment that you showed briefly and talked briefly about the redesign of the toolkit, and I think there's probably a lot of interest among our staff in how that would be accomplished and whether they would have input into the design. So I urge you to schedule separate presentations on just having to do with the redesign of the toolkit.
Sure. You know, the people here who are in charge of scheduling LC Digital Future and You have heard Bob's comment that Bob would like to see a presentation on the toolkit redesign. Bob also mentioned people at LC having input into the redesign. It's been redesigned, period. The design is done, basically. So no. There is a feedback tool that you can use if you're on the beta site to provide feedback, but you know, major redesign, again, that's not going to be accommodated. There was a team of developers, there was a company that worked on the user experience, there is a front-end developer, a back-end developer, so this wasn't just done based on, you know, the RSC people's favorite colors, that kind of a thing. There was thought put into this. So yeah, I would say that no, that LC is not going to have any significant input at this point into any design of the toolkit. And keep in mind, we're not the only users. So.